Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. I think that serving as a Member of Parliament is indeed an honour. I was nervous when I first ran for elections because I recognised it was a heavy responsibility. The job was certainly not easy, but the sense of fulfilment one gets from making people's lives better is more than anything money can quantify. I am humbled and touched each time a resident comes over to say thank you or expresses appreciation for what our team members have done for them. At the same time, I recognise that if one wants to be a minister, one will also need skills in managing large budgets and organisations and in making decisions involving complex considerations. In some ministries, such as law and finance, it will be necessary to have ministers who have strong technical skills in the areas too. It is in fact precisely because ministers and office holders require special skills that are quite different from the skills of ordinary MPs that many countries, including the US, have office holders who are appointed rather than elected. Even in the UK, which is probably the closest we have to our system, office holders are sometimes placed in the House of Lords because they have the necessary technical skills, even if they're not MPs. Now, I, for one, certainly don't think I have the skills or experience to run a ministry, and I'm sure many other MPs would share that view. We are happy to serve and fight for our residents, but the running of ministries requires people who are not only MPs, but who also have the necessary skills and experience in making decisions at that level. I certainly don't think we want ministers who are motivated by money. I also have the fullest confidence that both our party and the electorate are sophisticated enough to weed out such people. At the same time, though, we don't want money to be an obstacle to people entering politics. I think many of our current office holders probably took pay cuts to enter politics at the various levels they entered at. Now, this is naturally an emotional topic, and when dealing with divisive issues, I always think it is helpful to start on common ground. Surprisingly, notwithstanding the language used, I think there is actually a lot of agreement between people in this House. Now, when I listened to some of the debates yesterday, it reminded me a little bit of this story in Gulliver's Travels. When Gulliver landed in the land of Lilliput, there was a big divide between people who wanted to break eggs, soft-boiled eggs at the top end, and people who wanted to break it at the bottom end. But at the end of the day, what you arrive at is a cracked egg. So what is interesting here is, the Workers' Party has used very strong language to criticize the proposal of the committee, essentially calling it elitist for pegging salaries amongst the top 1,000 income earners. They then put forward their own rather precise proposal of pegging MP salaries to the MX9 pay grade in the civil service, using a 5-time multiple for the minister's salary. Now, when I asked the Workers' Party if they had made this proposal known to Mr. E's committee, it was only out of fairness because I myself had not heard that before. The first time I heard it was yesterday. And if they are going to level such strong criticism at Mr. E's committee, the least they could have done is put their ideas forward before the committee came up with their proposal, rather than slamming them afterwards for saying, why didn't you think of this before? Now, the public consultation was open for many months, and I think many Singaporeans had written in. I understand they received about 500 emails and messages, and that would probably mean there were 500 different opinions on what should be done. So in that sense, I think the committee had a very difficult job. However, in examining the exact principles used by the Workers' Party in its calculation, I actually think there is not that much difference between what the Workers' Party are proposing and what the committee in fact put forward, except that there is a small discount at each level. And the Workers' Party has also come a long way from their previously held public positions and pretty much abandoned most of them. So in that sense, I think the gap between members in this House has in fact become extremely narrow. Now, the Workers' Party said that the starting point of the calculation of MPs' allowances should be pegged at MX9 civil service pay grade. Now, I'm not a civil servant myself, so I just checked, and from what I understand, this is in fact not a wage that is at par with the average working level, as the Workers' Party have tried to represent. In fact, this is a wage that I understand is a super scale pay in the civil service. I think less than 2% of people in the civil service get this. So the Workers' Party's starting point is certainly not the average wage level as they have represented. It is in fact much higher than that. Now, I also disagree that an MP's allowance should be compared to a civil servant's pay because, for one thing, I don't know about the Workers' Party, but I know certainly most PAP MPs don't pocket the entire allowance. It is in fact a large part of the expenses we incur in running for our constituency as well. In other countries, MPs get expense accounts. We don't get that. The allowance is in fact the sum total of the expense account, and if there's anything left, then that could be considered salary, but I would hardly consider it that. So in that sense, I think thinking of the MP's allowance as a salary is perhaps the wrong starting point, because I don't think that's what it is. It is in fact an all-in package that encompasses amounts you have to give back to the community as well. But having said that, while I may disagree with them using that as a starting point, the number they come up with is not too far away from what we have right now. So again, we may disagree on how we want to crack the egg, but at the end of the day, I think the number we arrive at is not too far apart. The next point, the Workers' Party says the minister's salary should be pegged at 5 times the MP's allowance. So this basically means the MP's allowance is about 20% of the minister's pay. In fact, the committee recommended 17.5%. Again, not very far off, a 2.5% difference. And the Workers' Party doesn't explain why it came up with a multiple of 5 times rather than 4 or 6 times. I mean, it could have been any number in the air, but they decided on 5, which miraculously brings them very close to what the committee came up with. Another point that is interesting is the Workers' Party suggested the benchmark we use for an entry-level minister be $55,000. Now, what is interesting is this. The committee recommended $55,000 monthly salary as a benchmark, but the entry level was actually lower than that. In fact, it was precisely $46,750. So in fact, the Workers' Party is proposing a higher starting salary for ministers. And this is interesting because the difference in salary for 1 month is about $8,250. If you multiply that over the course of a year, the Workers' Party's starting salary for ministers amounts to about $99,000 more than what the committee recommended. Now, $99,000, incidentally, is about a 2-month bonus based on a base salary of $46,750. So although the Workers' Party has raised a big ruckus about the quantum of the bonus, the starting salary they have proposed incorporates a 2-month bonus based on the current starting salary. So they have in fact proposed a higher starting salary for ministers than even the committee recommended. So while the Workers' Party, kicks up a big fuss about the bonus right now, it is important to keep this in mind because any bonus they calculate for an entry-level minister would also be based on this higher starting salary. Now, the other point, and I think this is where we deal with the bonus itself. Mr. Gyam says that the average bonus should be pegged at 3 months rather than the 6 month the committee recommends. Now, one of the interesting points is this. I mean, my initial reaction to the bonus component also was that it was extremely high. And to be fair, I mean, I think that is a larger sum of money than most ordinary people would ever get. But when I looked at the targets that were set for the national bonus, I would also say that those targets are extremely hard to achieve. And I believe that DPM also clarified that the individual bonus component would be determined not only by the minister's contribution to his own ministry, but also to how much he contributed towards achieving the national bonus matrix. So in that sense, the national bonus matrix has become the target that our government has set out to achieve. And this target is a target that I don't think leaders of any other country have set out to achieve. And if you look at recent history, I don't think leaders of any other country have achieved. I mean, let's just look at some of the targets. Now, in order to achieve, say, the 6 month bonus, the so-called average bonus, right? Now, this sounds like a big number, but if you look at the targets, GDP has to grow in real terms by 3 to 5%. The income of the lowest 20% have to grow by 2 to 3% in real terms, and the median income has to grow by 2 to 3% in real terms. Now, the word real basically means that this has to take into account inflation. Now, inflation as at November, I believe, was about 5.7%. And inflation is pretty much a worldwide phenomenon. I mean, central banks all over the world are printing money. Commodity prices are shooting through the roof. So in fact, controlling inflation in itself is a challenge. But what the targets the government has undertaken actually involves not only making sure that incomes rise in line with inflation, but exceeding it. So what that basically means is that GDP growth in actual terms may have to be, well, if it's 3 to 5% in real terms, that would be 8.7 to 10.7%. Incomes, likewise, would have to grow between 7 to 8%. And this is, of course, if inflation comes down, those targets will come down. But the real point is that inflation is incorporated in all of these targets. And I don't know of any country anywhere in the world, developed country, where the government has been able to achieve these targets. So, indeed, even the target to get the so-called average bonus is a very difficult one. And if our office holders achieve that, I think the benefits to Singaporeans would be tremendous, especially to those average Singaporeans and also to those in the lower income groups. So in that sense, I would not begrudge them that. And while the Workers' Party also makes a big issue about the so-called 13-month maximum bonus, needless to say, the targets to achieve that would be astronomical, especially if inflation stays at the current levels. So if our government is able to achieve that, then I think the people of Singapore will be so much better off that a couple of months difference in pay is probably not that big a deal to divide this house over. I was also a little surprised when Mr. Gyam ended his speech by saying he opposes the motion, Because given how much common ground there is between the parties, it is stunning that he would actually want to oppose a motion that, in my view, is extremely progressive and brings us much closer to the Workers' Party's ideas than anyone has ever proposed before. Because by opposing the motion, what he's actually saying is that he would rather keep the existing pay scales than to move forward with the proposal the committee has put up. And I don't think anyone here would agree to that. Now, let me also deal a little bit with some of the previous positions taken by the Workers' Party, because I actually think this proposal actually touched a lot of the principles that were brought up back then as well. In 2006, for example, in an interview, Mr. Lau Tia Kiang said that the minister's salary should be set at about 100 times that of a worker in the lowest 20th percentile. At that time, he believed that this figure was $800. So back in 2006, Mr. Low was actually comfortable with a salary of $80,000 a month for a minister. He also took out the implication of this. What he said then is that it also means that if the income of the lowest person in the lowest 20% rose by $1,000, the ministers would get $100,000 more, not just a year, but a month. So he was actually quite comfortable with having ministers earn more if the lowest income workers earn more back in 2006. In many ways, the committee's proposal actually takes this principle into account. It, in fact, pretty much says that the income of the lowest 20% have to rise. Now, it is, in fact, even less generous than Mr. Lau in two respects. One, the base pay is lower, and two, the actual bonus is capped. It's not unlimited, whereas in Mr. Lau's example, the upside would have been unlimited. So, in fact, the salaries are less generous than what the Workers' Party proposed in 2006 in many ways. Now, in the Workers' Party's manifesto, the position was slightly different. They actually said both in 2006 and 2011 that the ministerial salaries should actually be pegged to the salaries of foreign leaders with all their expenses and so on taken into account. Now, the reality is this is a notoriously difficult exercise, and I notice that the Workers' Party, despite having said this the last 5 years, has not come up with a single proposal on what the numbers would actually be if this formula was applied. And they've had 5 years to come up with this. Now, I myself tried to do this exercise, and it was very, very difficult because a lot of the actual bonuses and perks are actually very obscure. I mean, I took a stab at Australia just because it was, the first country on the list. Now, over there, I think the Prime Minister receives an annual salary of $495,000 a year, which obviously, looks small compared to what our ministers earn. But the Prime Minister has 2 official residences while she's in office. Now, I think in previous sessions, the members of Parliament, the opposition, have said we are quite happy to have our ministers live in bungalows. The rental of a bungalow in Singapore, according to a property guru checked as of this morning, was between $25,000 to $42,000 a month. So actually, if you include that as part of the pay package as one of the perks, just monetizing that perk alone would probably amount to $300,000 to $400,000 more a year. And this excludes other perks such as free first-class travel for herself and her spouse for the rest of their lives, a fully paid-for office for the rest of their lives, and of course all the expenses involved in keeping up the house and so on would also be paid for by the state. So, and these are just some of the perks. There are of course lots of other perks, and I haven't had the ability to find out the values for all of them because they're found in so many different pieces of legislation and are so difficult to put together. So in that sense, our clean wage system, what you see is what you get, is in fact one of the most transparent you would find. And because of that, our ministers come under flak. But I think that is fair game, that people should know exactly what the cost of public office is, nothing hidden. Now, ministerial pay is a highly emotive issue. And I think the fact that the two sides of this House don't in fact differ that much in the ultimate outcome is a good start. And I hope that we can all get together and support this proposal, because ultimately it seems like we have more similarities than differences. Thank you.